He never heard the shot. The Japanese lookout on the bridge of a blacked-out freighter scanned an empty night while a U.S. skipper eased his boat to periscope depth, trimmed for silence, and touched the firing key. There was no screaming turbine, no comet tail of bubbles. The Mark-18 electric torpedo slid out like a whisper, ran deep beneath the target's keel, and turned quiet water into a hammer. A heave, a metallic crack, and the sea itself seemed to cough. The escort destroyer charged to the wrong bearing line and never saw the shooter. The submarine had already dipped, turned, and let the ocean close over its wake that did not exist. This is how America changed the Pacific. Not with noise, but with silence that killed. The secret was not magic. It was work. Early in the war, U.S. torpedoes failed, ran too deep, and broke hearts. America did the unglamorous thing. It tested, admitted faults, fixed exploders, and adopted the electric path. The Mark-18, inspired by captured German ideas, ran about 29 knots and left no wake. Range was practical for real combat, roughly 4,000 yards for early models, more with later tweaks. Most important, it was dependable, and dependable is what wins patrols. When your weapon works, courage multiplies. Pearl Harbor's combat submarine force turned this into a machine for victory. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood took reports from boats and turned them into doctrine fast enough to matter on the next patrol. Every war patrol report became a lesson. Approach from where escorts aren't looking, aim for under-keel shots, fire salvos, and vanish. The culture was simple. No alibis, fix the problem, attack again. That culture, open, hard, relentless, comes from a free people who trust truth more than ego. On deck and in torpedo rooms, the human piece made the difference. Sailors who had tuned farm tractors, wired barns, or fixed streetcars brought that same stubborn pride to a battery-driven weapon. A chief, torpedoman, ran his hands along the warhead seam and listened to the faint click of a gyro with the attention of a heart surgeon. A kid from Ohio, 19 years old, called out, "Hot, straight, and normal," and meant it. In the control room, the helmsman kept depth to the half-foot because sloppy is fatal. These were not supermen. They were Americans who believed that doing the simple things right under pressure is how you beat empires. Japanese captains had earned their reputations in a world of wakes, bearings, and audible turbines. The moment America's subs began firing electric fish from angles that left no trail, the playbook broke. Escorts threw patterns at guesses. Hydrophones heard too late. A destroyer's officer peered into foam and prayed. The next column wasn't where his ship would be. Respect the enemy. They were skilled and brave, but skill can be ambushed by a new fact, and the new fact was silence. Industry fed the ocean. Westinghouse and other firms built batteries and motors in volume, and the Navy standardized procedures so fleet boats could handle, test, and maintain the new torpedoes at sea. A conning tower's courage depends on somebody else's torque settings back in Pittsburgh. America closed that loop. Factories produced interchangeably, depots stocked parts, tenders rewired control boxes at forward bases, and boats reloaded and went back out. The line between a factory floor and a periscope eyepiece and the assembly floor faded to the same purpose. A nation that could turn car plants into shipyards could also turn a captured idea into a weapon system that bent the ocean to its will. Think about the moral advantage that powered the technical one. A free society let engineers speak hard truths. If the exploder failed, the memo said it. If a depth setting was wrong, someone proved it with a test shot and data. Pride took a back seat to results. That humility gave young skippers confidence to attack again after a miss, because the system cared more about learning than saving face. The Japanese Navy produced marvels of seamanship and courage, but its culture punished failure and hid defects until it was too late. Now return to the freighter that never heard the shot. Picture the smell of hot oil in the U.S. engine room, the copper tang of battery acid, the red glow of battle lanterns. Hear a quartermaster counting seconds between bearing lines. Feel the boat sink 2 feet as torpedomen shove another Mark-18 into the tube on velvet quiet rollers. Imagine the skipper's hand hovering over the firing key while he waits for the last degree of lead. He is not gambling. He is executing a craft refined by hundreds of runs and thousands of decisions. The hit under the keel does more than punch a hole. It snaps a spine. The ship tries to lift herself free of the water, fails, and folds. A low rain of rust comes down on the periscope head. The escorts flail and lay down thunder over empty ocean while the sub has already slid to a new depth, new course, new life. Somewhere aft, a crewman mutters a simple prayer for the men in that ship and then returns to the reload. Toughness and mercy live side by side in an American boat. We fight to win, and we remember the men we cannot save. This is not a story about a single invention. It is the story of a nation that turned ideas into tools, tools into doctrine, and doctrine into results at speed. By 1943, the Pacific shifted under Japan's feet because freedom learns faster. A weapon that makes no sound and leaves no trace became the voice of American resolve. It told the enemy without words that the ocean had changed ownership, and it told every citizen back home that the shop bench and the periscope lens were 2 ends of the same rifle. What began as a whisper ended as a roar on the charts. Convoys started vanishing. Tankers stopped arriving. The Empire's factories coughed and went quiet. Young Americans came home with hair gone grey and eyes, too, old. But they came home having done what was asked because their country built them a weapon worthy of their courage and gave them the truth they needed to use it well. That is the promise of a free republic under fire. We do not boast before the work. We simply do the work until the ocean says we have done enough. A typewriter clacked in Pearl Harbor while the room still smelled of coffee and diesel. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood stood over a table stacked with fresh patrol reports, margins crowded with grease pencil notes. By midnight, his staff would turn those pages into a change you could feel inside a submarine next week. A different approach angle, a new salvo doctrine, and a maintenance tweak that cut reload time by seconds that felt like hours at periscope depth. This was the American brain of the silent service, a headquarters that moved at the speed of danger, not paperwork. Lockwood cared about evidence. If a skipper's fish ran too deep, the next boat got corrected settings and a reason in plain English. If an underkeel shot broke a ship's back more reliably than a beam hit, the doctrine said so and told you how to get there without dying. He pushed live-fire tests even when it made careers nervous, because dead men deserve truth. In meeting after meeting, he cut through alibi and rumor with one habit: find the data, fix the cause, and move on. The Navy called the boats fleet submarines, but the crews called them homes. The fuel smelled like hot pennies, the air tasted like battery acid, and the bunks ran out before the men did. In that floating steel town, guidance from Pearl mattered more than speeches. When a new fire control page arrived, angles, speeds, gyro settings, men taped it near the TDC and read it until the paper went soft. When the order came to try electric shots at convoy centers, skippers listened because the memo came with results and names. It was not theory, it was survival. On shore, young women in the typing pool made doctrine physical. Yeoman Mary Collins triple-checked stencils, slid stacks of sheets into canvas pouches, and watched couriers carry ideas to the waterfront where tenders topped off fresh water and faith. Her brother flew a B-24. Her words would keep a submarine alive long enough to rescue someone like him. She worked and believed in a country that gave her a chair at the table of victory. In wartime, everyone gets a job that matters, and she made hers count. The Mark-18 electric torpedo changed how those pages read. No wake meant the old watch the rooster tail tactic died overnight. Quiet motors meant a firing solution no longer shouted its presence to an enemy hydrophone. The staff wrote new evasion rules: change depth after firing, alter course 10 degrees, and let the escorts hunt yesterday's position. Boats reported back that depth-charge barrages often bloomed where they had been, not where they were. The loop tightened until improvement felt continuous. Japanese destroyer officers drilled hard and risked much, but they trained to chase steam-driven signatures and to read wakes in moonlight. In 1943, those cues vanished. Escorts dumped charges on habit while US radio intelligence and radar turned convoys into patterns. A culture that punished bad news struggled to admit that technology had moved the fight into a new century. American culture, messy and loud, treated bad news like oxygen and moved forward. Numbers told the tale. Fewer than 2 out of every 100 Navy personnel wore the Dolphins, but their share of the war's result was huge. Merchant tonnage to Japan bled away month after month. Tankers mattered most. Without fuel, airplanes become statues and ships become prisons. Pearl tracked sinkings with pins on a wall map until the lanes looked like a blizzard. It was not a mystery. It was math written in steel. Lockwood's office also planned mercy. Lifeguard stations for airmen dotted patrol areas when major raids went in. Submarines that had just wrecked a convoy would backtrack into danger to fish a burning pilot from oil-slicked water, haul him aboard, and hand him a chocolate bar. The same quiet engines that sent a ship undercarried strangers home. That is American power, hard on targets, soft on the broken, and certain of the difference. A culture of learning beat a culture of ritual. When something failed, Americans fought the problem, not the person. Battery life short, fix chemistry and charging rules, depth keeping sloppy, reshim the planes, calibrate gauges, and train the helmsman under stress. An officer who took a bad shot wrote it down so the next officer could take a better one. That is how a free people fights. We share the bruise so no one else has to get it. The shock to the enemy showed up in the strangest ways. Escorts that used to sprint toward a wake now hovered, uncertain, burning fuel and time. Convoys that once sailed with confidence now hugged coasts, moved by night, and still vanished. A Japanese captain standing his bridge could not trust his eyes or his ears. The ocean, his old friend, kept secrets from him. His courage did not fade. His options did. By late 1943, the loop from patrol report to changed behavior was down to weeks. New radar sets multiplied night vision. New sonars sharpened bearings. Wolfpack tactics matured from bold experiments into dependable teamwork. The Americans were moving up a staircase, while the enemy circled the same landing. The proof was in each ship-sunk line and in the absence of enemy arrivals at their own piers. Here is the truth that makes the heart proud. Our victory was built from honesty. We faced our own defects at the start, fixed them in public, and kept climbing. Young sailors took that gift and gave it back at 300 feet, with depth charges cracking paint and nerves. Their courage was multiplied by a home front that refused to lie. That is the American way of war. Tell the truth, make it better, and send it back, into the storm. The typewriter in Pearl kept clacking, the courier kept running, the boats kept sailing, the pages changed, and with them the ocean changed. In the end, convoys did not fail because of speeches. They failed because a system of free minds built a weapon, wrote a rule, taught a crew, and repeated. The enemy looked across black water and saw nothing. That nothing was the shape of our power. The convoy thought darkness was safety. 3 American submarines thought darkness was a ladder. They climbed it together, each on a rung, one ahead of the track, one abeam, one astern, all whispering through the same black water. A burst of radio code stitched them into a single blade. The lead boat eased inside the screen, found the fat tankers, and put 2 electric fish under a keel. The second boat hit the opposite flank. The third waited for the escorts to lunge and then cut the stragglers down. In minutes, a night, supposed to protect, had turned into a trap sprung from 2 sides. Wolfpacks were not new, but American wolfpacks were different. They ran on radios the enemy could not quite solve, on radar that made night a friend, and on doctrine that let skippers make decisions at the edge. You do not get that by accident. You get it by a headquarters that believes in you, a factory that hands you reliable gear, and a culture that treats failure as tuition. In 1943 and 1944, that blend matured, and convoys that used to feel protected learned a new fear. Silent arrows from two sides in the same minute. On one of those nights, a radio man named Jose Martinez kept the code flowing with fingers that did not shake even when depth charges started their drumbeat. His job was not glamorous. He sat in a box, listened, sent, received, and kept the timing clean so three boats would not collide in the dark. But when a tanker erupted in a geyser of flame and the escorts sprinted to nowhere, his calm hands were one reason why. In America's system, the small job is the big job at the right minute. Escorts tried to split the difference. Some charged the first bearing line they saw. Some hovered, trying to hear a turbine or sniff a wake. The Mark-18 offered no such clues. A destroyer might find only foam and shame. Meanwhile, the second American boat shifted 2 degrees, fired again, and then slid away on quiet motors that sounded like a sewing machine far below. The third boat finished its waiting game with a single under-keel shot that folded a freighter like a bad hinge. It looked like luck. It was system. The Japanese fought hard. They switched routes. They sailed by night. They added more escorts and drilled harder. They were not fools. They were professionals meeting a new kind of math. When your opponent learns faster than your system can absorb change, courage cannot close the gap. A destroyer captain could not uninvent radar. A convoy commodore could not conjure fuel from empty tanks. A nation cannot eat ships. It never sees again. Think about fuel. Oil was life to Japan's war machine. Tankers were the bloodstream. When a wolf pack took down 2 in a night, whole air groups went quiet weeks later. Pilots discovered that flying hours vanished. Battleships that had once paraded now became grey hotels. The chart in Pearl that tracked tanker sinkings did not need captions. Each pin was a turned-off engine somewhere far away. Americans learned to aim for that effect and kept shooting until the strategy became obvious even to the enemy. On the other side of the periscope, a Japanese sailor tried to make sense of silence. He had trained to see wakes, to hear turbines, to smell exhaust when the wind was right. Now he saw foam with no direction and heard depth charges that chased memories. He was not a villain. He was a man in a war set by his leaders and shaped by forces he could not stop. In another life, he might have traded coins with the American radioman and argued about baseball. War stole that chance and handed him a sky the color of iron and water that tasted like fear. What makes the American story special is not just the steel. It is the trust. Headquarters trusted skippers. Skippers trusted crews. Crews trusted a girl at a typewriter and a man with a wrench in a plant they would never see. That web of trust let 3 boats act like one mind without asking permission in the dark. It made speed. Speed made surprise. Surprise made sinkings. Sinkings made strategy. Strategy ended a war sooner than it might have ended, and fewer boys from every side died because of it. The pack slipped away before dawn. The ocean flattened and took back its secrets. In the radio shack, Jose rubbed his eyes and logged the last clean group. The captain signed the entry like a notary of fate. In the torpedo room, men cleaned tubes, checked seals, and fed another Mark-18 into a cradle with the tenderness of a nurse. Breakfast smelled like coffee and hot bread. Someone told a bad joke. Then the boat turned toward the next lane because this was a job, not a legend, and legends are only the truth repeated until they shine. By the time word reached Tokyo that 2 tankers and a freighter had vanished, the decision had been made for them somewhere in a factory in Ohio and on a chart table in Pearl. That is the hardest lesson. War teaches. Events at sea are the last link in a chain forged in minds and hands far away. The Wolfpack was only the visible tip of a system that married science to courage and democracy to discipline. The enemy learned that too late. We learned it in time, and the sea changed flags. The convoy thought darkness was safety. 3 American submarines proved darkness belonged to the side that could think together, move fast, and shoot straight. The Mark-18's quiet heart beat under every scene. The pack's radios were the nerves. The crews were the muscle. The doctrine was the brain. When a nation lines those pieces up, the result feels like destiny. It isn't destiny. It is freedom doing work at speed. The moon was down, and the sea was black glass when three shadows rose and split the night. USS Parsh, under Commander Lawson P. Ramage ran on the surface like a wolf among sheep, radar painting shapes that meant fuel, food, and steel for Japan's war. To starboard, USS Steelhead kept pace like a knife. To the west, a third boat waited quiet, listening. A convoy beat toward Honshu, trusting darkness. Parsh's men slid Mark-18 electrics into the tubes and checked gyros with ritual care. He attacked with a calm that read as fury. A tanker took the first blow, no wake to warn, no scream of turbines, just a deep thump and a spout of water that carried fire. Steelhead crossed the T and smashed a freighter that tried to swing out. The third boat, patient and hungry, finished a straggler. Escorts lunged down the most obvious bearing line and found nothing but foam and the echo of their own screws. The Americans shifted 2 degrees, fired again, and then again. It looked reckless. It was discipline with teeth. Parsh's attack of the 31st of July 1944 became legend, and Ramage earned the Medal of Honor for fighting his ship from the bridge through explosions and machine gun fire. The details matter because they show the engine of victory. Radios that stitched a pack together, radar that turned night into day, torpedoes that moved like whispers, and a command that trusted a commander to decide in the moment. America's gift was not one tool. It was a whole toolkit carried by free men who knew how to use it. That is why American nights turned deadly for enemy convoys. There was something else at work that night. The quiet arithmetic of fuel. Every tanker that failed to reach port meant pilots without hours, destroyers without range, and factories without power. Japan could launch ships. It could not launch oil. The men in Parsh did not talk about grand strategy. They talked about bearing lines, spread angles, and reload times. And yet each hit they made rippled out to empty airfields and cold furnaces. Victory rides on logistics, and logistics ride on hulls that never make it home when hunted by quiet fish. A young radioman, Jose Martinez, kept the code tight while depth charges pounded the sea like a god's drum. He had a photo of El Paso taped inside his locker and a habit of counting under his breath when the captain said, "Stand by." He did not fire a torpedo that night. He made it possible for others to fire 3. "Hold it together," he muttered as he sent the burst that placed Steelhead across the convoy's nose. A small job in the right minute can carry a nation on its back. On the enemy bridges, men did their duty. They scanned for wakes and listened for turbine whine, both of which the Mark-18 denied them. They dropped patterns on habit and hope. One destroyer commander, honest and brave, told his gunnery officer later, "We fought an enemy we could not see and could not hear." The point is not to mock him. The point is to show how fast America moved the fight out from under his feet. He was as good as yesterday. The Americans had become tomorrow. There is a kind of courage only a free country can buy in bulk. The courage that comes from knowing the system behind you tells the truth and has your back. When early torpedoes failed, Pearl admitted it, tested again, and fixed what was broken. When electric fish proved their worth, industry answered with batteries and motors at a scale that stunned statisticians. Westinghouse wound armatures that would spin in silence under the Pacific. Tenders in forward bases rewired control boxes so skippers could count on every shot behaving the same. The Americans hit again before midnight. Another tanker folded, and the convoy's backbone broke. Fires painted the undersides of clouds, turning night into dirty sunrise. Ramage stayed topside amid tracers because he believed speed was life and example is a weapon. He shouted bearings and orders over the roar and signed his name to the risk. Steelhead cut back in as the escorts chased ghosts astern. The third boat picked off a lame duck and then slid away. When the sea went dark again, the convoy's empty slots flashed like missing teeth. In the quiet after, men wrote short notes home on government postcards. They did not brag. They said they were fine and asked for pictures. In the torpedo room, someone made coffee that tasted like rust and hope. The chief called for a check on battery temperatures and ran his hand along the warhead seams one more time. Hot, straight, and normal, he said again, like grace after a meal. The boat turned toward another lane because the job was not finished. If you want the one-sentence summary of that night, it is this. America trusted ordinary men with extraordinary tools and the authority to use them, and those men made darkness ours. The enemy was brave, but bravery without the right tools meets a wall it cannot climb. The Mark-18 did not shout. It simply worked. Radar did not boast. It simply saw. Doctrine did not preen. It simply told the truth and changed when the truth changed. That is how a free republic beats an empire at sea. The convoy never arrived. The factories that waited for it slowed. The pilots who expected its fuel sat in ready rooms and listened to the wind. The escorts that fought that night did not lack heart. They lacked a way to hear what was coming. The ocean belonged to the side that learned faster and built faster and moved faster. The men in those 3 boats were the point of a spear forged far away by people who believed that simple work, done right and on time, can change the world. And that night it did, loudly in results and softly in sound. The wakeless torpedoes, the fast radios, the trust up and down the chain, all of it fused into one truth. America had learned how to turn silence into thunder. A machinist in Milwaukee wipes coolant from his hands and checks a torque wrench against a card that says, Mark-18 motor assembly. He does not know the skipper who will trust this armature at 300 feet, but he cares when the thing on the bench means someone in danger. Across the country, in a factory that once made household goods, women in blue coveralls build storage batteries cell by cell, the acid biting their gloves. In San Diego, a tender crewman files a relay contact until it gleams like a coin and writes a number on a tag. Small hands, big war. War turned the United States into one long assembly line. Willow Run put a B-24 on the ramp every 63 minutes. Westinghouse wound armatures, Exide poured plates, and Navy yards standardized the little things that make the big thing reliable. A boat could swap a failed component with confidence because the people back home honored the tolerance on a drawing like a promise. Interchangeability made certainty. The electric torpedo changed more than the noise picture. It changed how sailors felt about their tools. A quiet motor meant the shooter did not warn the hunted. No bright trail across the water meant the hunted could not trace the attacker's line. Range about 4,000 yards and speed near 29 knots turned doctrine into muscle memory. Get inside the screen, shoot under the keel, change depth and course, reload, repeat. A weapon you trust does not make you reckless, it makes you precise. The best illustration of America's character is what our power did when it had a chance to be kind. On the 2nd of September 1944, USS Finback pulled a young naval aviator from the Pacific near Chichijima after his TBM Avenger went down. Salt burned his eyes, oil clung to his skin, until a grey shape rose and strong hands hauled him aboard. The boat gave him water, a blanket, and a bunk. His name was George H.W. Bush. The silent service that wrecked convoys also saved lives. Walk through a stateside plant and see the faces. A foreman who ran a garage, a chemistry graduate leading 50 on the plate line, a woman who lost a brother at sea and stamps acceptance tags with care. They do not give speeches, they hit numbers. One every shift. The sign above the line reads, and they beat it. It is democracy in work clothes. The Mark-18 did not appear out of air. American engineers studied, captured German electrics, learned what worked, and added what the fleet needed. That is humility used as a weapon. Copy the good, fix the bad, build at scale. You see it in manuals, plain words, and clear drawings. A tender sailor can follow at 0200 with a flashlight. You see it in the way depots at Pearl or Saipan could pull a control box, swap a relay, test a gyro, and sign the boat out before sunset. Speed lived in paper as much as in metal. By late 1943, Japanese escorts found themselves guessing. Surge toward the last feather, hold and listen, drop charges on the predicted bearing. There was no right answer when the wake was gone and the motor was quiet. A brave man can choose in that fog. He cannot make it lift. The Americans had pulled the cues that trained his instincts. He was left with courage and habit from a world that no longer existed. Industry kept feeding the ocean. Train cars rolled with navy crates. Tenders turned harbors into floating shops. A skipper with a bulky gyro got a fix, not a lecture. A chief got brushes the same day. Small things made a force grow stronger, instead of relying on luck. Under 2% of Navy personnel wore dolphins, yet the force sank over half of Japanese merchant tonnage. Each pin on a chart in Pearl meant a factory at half power, a squadron grounded, a city without rice. The people in Milwaukee and Pittsburgh and San Diego were the unseen hands on those pins. Their work did not carry rifles, it carried the war. There were hard days. A battery cell boiled and had to be swapped underway. A control piston stuck, and a tube had to be rebuilt in a swell. A torpedo ran erratic, and a crewman wrote a memo so the next boat would not take the same risk. That honesty is our secret weapon. We can say, "This failed," without fear that truth will ruin us. In America, truth repairs. A destroyer commander in the enemy fleet might look back on those months and remember flashes on the horizon where a convoy used to be. He would remember the way his crew held their breath and listened to a sea that would not answer. He would smell crude and cordite and know his best effort could not bridge a gap built by someone else's industry and someone else's freedom. Respect that man. Respect also the girl at the typewriter, whose clean stencil told a skipper exactly how to live through the next attack. Back in Milwaukee, the machinist checks the torque wrench again and stamps a number he will never see. In Luzon Strait, a helmsman trims 2 inches shallow and feels the boat answer like a living thing. The line between them is a rail line, a ship, a tender, a toolbox, and a doctrine manual. But really it is a promise. If you do your job, someone else will do theirs, and together you will bend events. That promise is America's greatest factory. It makes victory out of parts. The next crate goes on a truck under a sign that says, "Keep 'em firing." The next boat slides under a cloud and listens. Somewhere, a man with a wrench and a woman with a stamp made sure the Mark-18 inches that tube will do exactly what the book says it will do. That is the difference between hope and certainty. The ocean does not care, but the ocean notices. The first time a skipper watched a perfect spread miss, it felt like betrayal. Early in the war, the Mark-14 steam torpedo ran too deep, exploded when it should have stayed silent, and sometimes broke when it should have exploded. Men risked their lives and watched wakes streak past under a target's keel. The problem was not courage. The problem was a weapon that lied. The United States could have hidden that. Instead, Admiral Charles A. Lockwood told his force the truth and demanded fixes. They took torpedoes to Hawaiian waters and fired them into nets and cliffs. They measured depth, logged failures, and tore open exploders with wrenches. The verdict was hard and clear. The Mark-14 ran deep, and the Mark-6 magnetic exploder was untrustworthy in real seas. Orders went out to disable magnetic influence, recalibrate depth settings, and rework contact pistols so they would not shatter on an angled hit. It was messy, it was loud, and it saved lives. In a free system, bad news is a tool, not a crime. The question, whispered by men who still had to sail, was, if the old torpedo failed us, what makes the new one different? The answer came from engineers with plain voices and from factories with clean records. The Mark-18 electric torpedo traded the steam wake for quiet thrust. It traded questionable pistols for reworked contacts. It traded guesswork for manuals that matched reality. Give us a weapon that does what the book says. A chief torpedoman told a visiting officer, and the shops delivered. Out at sea, the change felt like peace in a storm. Skippers lined up shots, knowing they would not announce themselves with a white tail. Under keel hits bent ships in half. Misses were rare enough to feel like flukes rather than fates. The doctrine changed, too. Post-shot procedures became muscle memory. Change depth and course. Stay on batteries. Let escorts pounce on where you were. Patrol reports stopped reading like laments and started reading like plans that worked. There is another truth that speaks to who we are. When things went wrong, we wrote it down with names and dates so the next crew could avoid the same pain. A contact pistol cracked? Log it. A battery cell spiked? Log it. A gyro wandered? Log it. Those logs did not end careers. They ended problems fast. That is the American answer to the question every crewman asks at 300 feet. Does my country tell me the truth? The enemy saw the shift without knowing its cause. Escorts found fewer wakes to chase. Patterns that once predicted American behavior now led into empty water. A Japanese officer peered at a sea like a wall. Courage alone cannot restore cues a better weapon has erased. A hard moment came with a name we honor and remember. On the 24th of October 1944, USS Tang, commanded by Richard H. O'Kane, fired at a target in the Formosa Strait. One of her own torpedoes circled back, a rare and vicious fault. The boat was lost, many died, others became prisoners. What we can say, and must, is that the same honest system that fixed the Mark-18 and fielded the Mark-18 also learned from Tang's fate, hunted the defect, and drove failure rates to the floor. We fixed what could be fixed and kept fighting. The force emerged from that crucible stronger. By 1943 and 1944, the submarine arm was killing shipping at a rate that shocked analysts and enemy planners. Under 2% of Navy personnel wore dolphins, yet their share of Japan's merchant losses passed half. Tankers were special targets, sink one and you erase flights, convoys and factory shifts weeks later. You could feel it in intercepted traffic and see it in empty piers. Quotes mattered because they showed souls, not just stats. We don't look for glory, a torpedoman wrote home. We look for bearing lines that end with a boom. A rescued aviator, shivering on deck, whispered, "You sound like a sewing machine," amazed by the quiet motors that saved him. A Japanese petty officer, captured after his ship broke in two from an underkeel blast, told an interviewer, "There was no wake. We never saw it." 3 sentences, 1 story. Lockwood's staff backed philosophy with process. Orders codified spread patterns that matched the Mark-18's strengths. Tenders carried spares that turned maintenance into schedule. Torpedo schools trained men to treat each step as sacred. A nation that can make a B-24 every 63 minutes can also make a checklist that saves men at sea. The checklist spread across the Pacific like a steady tide. The problem revelation cycle became muscle memory too. Problem, depth, keeping drift, revelation. Recalibrate after hard dives, add a verification step before patrol, publish the procedure fleet-wide. Problem, contact heads cracking on oblique hits, revelation. Rework the parts, prove it, send the bulletin. Problem, escorts getting lucky with last known positions, revelation. Standardize the post-shot depth and course change so luck runs out. These are not headlines, they are habits that change outcomes. By the time the public heard Wolfpack or Hellcats, the quiet work had paid the bill. The system that admitted error and built at scale turned a shaky beginning into a remorseless endgame. Convoys faded. Imports shrank. Invisible pressure breaks a nation's back. The last measure is the scoreboard. It said American subs strangled an empire with math, honesty, and the quiet hum of electric motors. Men who had watched early spreads fail finished the war aiming at ship centers and expecting the underkeel detonation that snaps a spine. They had earned that confidence by facing pain and telling the truth. They took that confidence into night water and made it count. The first time a skipper watched a perfect spread miss, it felt like betrayal. The last time he pressed the firing key, it felt like certainty. That journey through error, test, fix, and triumph is the American way under stress. We make the truth our ally and let time do the boasting. In the end, The sea kept our secrets, the enemy felt our results, and the weapon that once lied gave way to one that whispered and did its job. That is how a free people solves a problem and wins a war. The day Japan ran out of ocean began on a grey morning when a Japanese freighter stacked fuel drums on its deck because tankers kept disappearing. The crew smelled raw crude in the wind and watched the horizon for wakes. None appeared. A U.S. submarine was out there, below periscope depth, running on batteries that hummed like a sewing machine. The skipper studied the convoy's heartbeat on radar, edged inside the screen, and chose the ship that mattered most. One electric torpedo left the tube without a scream. It ran deep, under the keel, and the sea did the rest. The freighter tried to lift herself and failed. The escorts charged a bearing that was already old. The submarine turned away in silence. A day later, pilots on a distant airfield learned they would get fewer flying hours because those fuel drums never reached a refinery. That's how oceans can end for an island empire, one missing ship at a time, multiplied by hundreds. Under 2% of America's Navy wore the twin dolphin badge, but they strangled an economy across the map. They learned where fuel moved, when ore sailed, and how rice crossed seas, then aimed for arteries, not just muscles. It was not theatre, it was arithmetic. U.S. submarines sank more than half of all Japanese vessels lost in the war, including millions of tons of merchant shipping and hundreds of thousands of tons of naval vessels. Every pin pushed into the wall map at Pearl Harbor meant a factory idled, a squadron grounded, a furnace gone cold, a family short of rice. The silent service did not need cheering sections. It needed working torpedoes, hard truth, and a steady stream of orders that made sense. That stream never ran dry. Patrol reports arrived at Pearl by the stack and fed a culture that moved as fast as combat. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood's staff changed approach angles, salvo sizes, reload drills, and evasion routines in weeks, not months. The Mark-18 electric torpedo made the changes stick. A torpedo that left no wake let skippers fire in daylight without giving themselves away. Its quiet motor took the old cues, rooster-tail bubbles that once pointed at the shooter and erased them. A destroyer officer who had trained to read wakes and listen for turbine scream now faced an ocean that kept secrets. He did his duty anyway. He dropped patterns and prayed. He watched foam and guessed. Sometimes guesses saved him. Mostly they didn't. The proof was everywhere. Merchant ships hugged coasts and sailed by night. Convoys zigzagged and doubled their escorts. Crews lashed fuel drums to decks to make up for lost tankers, a desperate choice in a world where a fire could own the sky. Still, the sinkings mounted. The submarine force didn't just fire and leave. It returned to pull downed aviators from oil slicks and swells, handed them blankets and chocolate, and went back to work. On the 2nd of September 1944, USS Finback hauled a 20-year-old naval aviator named George H.W. Bush from the sea near Chichijima. The same quiet motors that broke convoys saved a life that would one day lead the nation. American power could be lethal before noon and generous by afternoon. That duality wasn't an act. It came from values set long before the war. Those values showed in little things. A tender electrician in a forward anchorage filed a relay contact to mirror brightness because a skipper deserved a firing circuit that didn't lie. A machinist in Milwaukee checked a torque wrench against a card and stamped a number that guaranteed a motor would spin in the dark. A yeoman typed a new tactic into a mimeograph stencil and sent it across the Pacific with ink still drying. None of them asked for statues. They wanted the next patrol to come home. The enemy's courage never failed. Japanese captains sprinted into black water and covered crippled ships with their own hulls. Gunners fired at bursts of periscope spray. Depth-charge crews worked until their hands shook. But the fight had moved. Radar pulled back the curtain on night. Radio discipline stitched wolf packs into one mind. The Mark-18 turned firing into a whisper, and a learning culture sent each improvement to sea with ruthless speed. In a contest between habit and revision, Revision won because it told the truth faster. Result became rumor. Rumor became fear. Fear became math. By late 1943 and through 1944, imports to the home islands fell off a cliff. Tankers took the worst of it, with US boats slicing into convoys that thought darkness was enough to live. Fuel shortfalls ground down aviation training. Factories idled for lack of coal and oil. Warships stayed in port, engines cold and proud flags limp. The Japanese people, brave and enduring, paid the bill with ration cards and silence in kitchens. The silent service never saw those kitchens, but every ship-sunk line item reached them just the same. The shock of it is simple. A small volunteer arm of the Navy, backed by factories filled with everyday Americans, twisted the war's spine by method more than miracle. Theirs was not a story of a single raid. It was repetition with intent. Plan, fire, disappear, report, improve, repeat. A nation built on candor and tools turned that loop into a noose. When historians say Japan ran out of ocean, they mean its ships ran out of safe water to cross, its crews ran out of good options, and its leaders ran out of answers that mattered. That is not boasting. That is an honest map, seen from altitude, with too many pins in one color. The day ended the way it began. A U.S. boat listened, took bearings, adjusted 2 degrees, and faded into deep water, conserving its batteries for the night work ahead. On a faraway field, mechanics rolled an airplane back into a hangar because there wasn't enough fuel to fly. The submarine's cook served coffee that tasted like iron and comfort. The captain wrote a calm line in the log. The ocean, indifferent and wide, knew who had learned faster. And the empire that once ruled the sea lanes learned something hard. When a free people decide to master silence, the silence gets loud. They called them Heidmann's Hellcats, 9 U.S. SEAL submarines ordered to do the impossible slip-through, mined straits, and hunt inside the Sea of Japan in June 1945. The packs had nicknames like Hepcats, Polecats, and Bobcats. The names sounded playful. The work was not. Each boat carried FM sonar for mine detection, fresh doctrine for running narrow, and crews who knew the math by heart. If they broke in clean, convoys would die in waters once considered sanctuary. With hell's bells ringing on speakers as a dare and a joke, they went in anyway. The lead boats threaded the Tsushima Strait at night, past shaped metal that could tear a hull like paper. A wrong meter killed you. Confidence came from charts drawn by hands that had never seen those waters, and from a nation that pushed good tools forward, even in the war's last months. Inside the Sea of Japan, the Hellcats split like a fan. Bowfin, Flying Fish, and Tinosa hunted as Bob Risser's Bobcats. Skate, Tunny, and Bonefish worked as the Polecats. Sea Dog, Creval, and Spadefish made up the Hepcats. Their orders were clear: prove there was no safe sea left, hit shipping hard, and get out again. In the weeks between commence firing and 20 June, they sank ships in a string that read like a reckoning. Bonefish never came back. The others did, 5 of them returning to Pearl Harbor together on the 4th of July 1945, a picture in grey steel and easy smiles that says more than any speech. All 9 captains earned the Navy Cross or a Gold Star in lieu, because courage loves company. The set-piece moments still make the heart race. A skipper eased up to periscope depth and saw a convoy where charts once promised safety. He let an electric fish go that left no telltale white scar across the surface. A ship heaved, broke, and folded. The escorts thundered to the last known bearing, while the hunter drifted down a few meters and slid aside. A second boat crossed the bow and cut down a straggler. A third waited cold and finished the tail-end Charlie that thought luck was a plan. It looked like terror from above. It looked like rehearsal from below. The Hellcats brought more than nerve. They brought learning that had been paid for since 1942. Each patrol carried doctrine that assumed mines, forced crossings, and tight replacements. Sonarmen trained to read FM pulses like music. Quartermasters fought currents as if wrestling a big fish. Engineering officers nursed batteries, so the last yard inside a gate felt as quiet as the first. Mark-18 electrics did their work without shouting about it. The old Q's bubble wakes that tattled on a shooter, turbine squeal that gave a bearing were gone. The enemy tried to update tactics under fire and under fear. That is not a good classroom. Japanese defenders fought with grit. They swept channels, lit searchlights, and laid fresh mine lines like fences built in a hurry. Shore batteries opened on flashes that might be periscopes or might be lies, the waves told them. Escorts had to choose, stay near the convoy or sprint toward a ghost. They made good choices in a bad game. In late June they found one of ours. Bonefish failed to return. A hole in the formation that felt like a missing tooth when the survivors showed their flags back at Pearl. Honor counts losses as well as victories. The Hellcats did both. Even with pain, the ledger turned. The Sea of Japan had been a pantry. It became a trap. In a matter of weeks, the Hellcats sank more than 24 merchant vessels and even an escort. They proved that minefields could be read, that doctrine could get you in and out, and that the Empire's backyard was not safe enough to save it. The signal to Tokyo was simple. The ocean no longer obeyed you. The signal to Pearl was simpler still. The system works this late in the war because we kept improving when fatigue begged us to stop. One photo tells the story's core. On Independence Day 1945, 5 submarines, Flying Fish, Spadefish, Tinosa, Bowfin, and Skate eased into Pearl Harbor together. Crews waved, flags snapped. They had gone where no one said you could go, done what no one said you could do, and then come home in time for a holiday. You can point at medals, and you should. You can point at tonnage columns, and you should. But point, too, at the simple proof. 9 boats, 3 packs, weeks of hunting, 1 lost, and a message writ on water sanctuary is a myth when freedom brings tools and will. There's a line you can write in grease pencil on any chart. The American way of war is to question, test, and try anyway. Operation Barney was that line. The mines were real. The charts were imperfect. The risks were not hidden. Crews were told everything, then allowed to choose professional courage because their profession had been honored with the best gear, clear orders, and truth without varnish. That combination feels like a cheat code in history. It isn't. It's the shape of a republic under strain. When they left the Sea of Japan, the Hellcats slowed and formed up, mine dodgers turning back into a parade. Someone piped music. Someone laughed too hard. Someone stared at the sky and counted blessings. Back at the forward base, tenders went to work the minute lines went over. Brush changes, relay replacements, shaft checks, fresh food aboard, and mail handed out with shaking hands. Then the logs were copied, the lessons pulled, and the cycle began again. That loop, fight, learn, fix, repeat was the real miracle. If you need a closing image, hear the mines pinging back as faint echoes. See the periscope wake like a line of breath, and feel a boat pass under a gate that once kept enemies out and now kept promises in. Operation Barney took away the last safe room in a burning house. In the final weeks of the war, Japan could not move enough to matter. That is what 9 submarines proved with charts, guts, and batteries. That is what America does at its best. Go where the map says don't. Come back with proof, and make the world different by the weekend. The math of victory fits on a single wall. In Pearl Harbor, yeomen pinned colored markers to a big map and wrote tonnage on a board. Merchant ships sunk, tankers destroyed, naval vessels erased. Pins multiplied until sea lanes looked like snowfall. Behind each pin lay a firing solution, a crew at battle stations, and a torpedo that did exactly what the manual said it would do. The numbers did not brag. They simply added up. U.S. submarines sank more than half of all Japanese vessels lost in the war, over 4.7 million tons of merchant shipping, and more than 500,000 tons of naval ships. And they did it with a force that was a sliver of the Navy's. Head count. This is the part of the story that stops conversation. A tiny community strangled a nation's movement with a quiet weapon and relentless method. Numbers matter because they touch lives. When a tanker vanished, pilots trained less. Factory managers stared at empty rail siding. Island garrisons waited on piers that stayed quiet. The submarine force aimed for that effect on purpose by 1,943, tankers first, ore carriers next, food whenever the target matrix allowed. It wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. Starve fuel, and you starve flight hours. Starve ore, and you starve industry. Starve rice, and you starve morale. A nation on islands lives or dies by hulls and schedules. The silent service rewrote both. The tally has names, not just columns. Spadefish stacked up tonnage like a ledger balanced in ink. Bowfin ran 9 patrols that cut across the war like stitches closing a wound. Archerfish put 6 torpedoes into the carrier Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, and watched a giant vanish in darkness. Parsh planted shots through a convoy's ribs and brought Lawson P. Red Ramage a Medal of Honor earned on a bridge flooded with tracer fire and spray. Each boat had a story that fit into the sum like a gear. Numbers also tell cost. 52 U.S. submarines did not return. More than 3,400 officers and enlisted men were lost. The force's casualty rate was among the highest of any American arm in the war. The dolphins on a sailor's chest were not decoration. They were a bet placed on courage, training, and procedures that save lives most of the time, but not every time. When you run in black water, you pay in fear first and sometimes in finality. The wall map does not show empty chairs. The boat's plaques do. Still, the final curve points only one way. By mid-1945, American submarines sometimes struggled to find targets because there were too few left. That is the strangest victory. Success that erases your work. Convoy signals went silent. Port captains shuffled paper without ships to assign. Some freighters sailed with deck cargo, balanced like teetering hopes. The math no longer favored the empire. It punished it. What made the math American was how it was assembled. A free people put engineers, foremen, chiefs, and skippers into one problem and let them argue toward the truth. A torpedo was tested, found wanting, fixed, and replaced without shame. A tactic was tried, measured, and changed if the data said so. Locks on information stayed open because lives depended on it. If a battery chemistry performed better at a given temperature range, the note went fleet-wide by the end of the month. If a gyro tended to drift after a hard dive, the checklist line grew teeth. The math was not magic, it was management with morals. Enemy officers saw the sum even if they could not read the whole equation. They watched wakes vanish. They saw convoys mauled from 2 sides in minutes. They filled out reports that had too many unknowns in the attacker box. They were not beaten because they were foolish. They were beaten because their system did not let them change fast enough, and because the other side's quiet torpedo bled proof into the sea. There are sentences from the front that belong in any ledger. "We are running on fumes," a Japanese pilot told a comrade on a field, where aircraft sat, ready and useless. "No wake," a captured petty officer said after the ship he served, folded under an unseen hit. "Do it by the book," a U.S. chief said, "because the book is why we're alive." None of those are poetry, they are receipts. If you want a single, holy shit fact, hold this one. A community that amounted to about 1.5% to 2% of the Navy accounted for more than half the enemy's lost shipping. Another, between commence firing and 20 June 1945, 9 boats in a mined sea made the term sanctuary a joke. Another, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine went down to a quiet fish in the night. These are not slogans, they are bricks. Build with them and you get a wall you can lean truth against. In the end, the math of victory turned into the music of homecomings. Boats slid past piers where bands played and families waited with faces that said everything. Logs were signed closed. Patrol flags were added to. The pins on the wall were counted and left there as a kind of prayer. The United States did not win the Pacific by chance. It did it with subtraction of hulls, of shipments, of options performed by men whose tools worked and whose leaders told them the truth. When the numbers stop talking, look at the ocean on a calm day and remember that silence won it. Captain Tamechi Hara stood on a Japanese destroyer's bridge and watched a friend's ship stagger from a blow that seemed to come from nowhere. No wake, no scream of a turbine, just a heave and a break and a plume that slapped at the sky. He ordered a counterattack into silence and stared at water that gave him nothing back. He had trained his whole life to read wakes, judge bearings by ear, and smell exhaust when the wind was right. In 1943 and after, the old cues died. He wrote later about amazing Allied scientific equipment and the way superiority vanished in a season. It must have felt like the ground leaving your feet. From below, the scene was almost gentle. A US skipper kept his periscope just clear enough to draw a pencil line on the sea. He set his target under the crosshairs, counted the lead, and touched the key. The Mark-18 electric torpedo left the tube like a well-kept promise. No shouting turbine, no long feather that tattled to every lookout. It ran deep, under the keel where ships are least able to forgive a mistake. The detonation bent steel the way a hand bends cardboard. Periscope glass blurred with spray. The skipper dipped, changed course, and held his breath against the first depth charges that thumped water but not him. Hara's respect for his adversaries reads clean on the page. He knew competence when he saw it. He watched Allied gear and methods advance faster than his sides could. He saw how radar turned night into day, and how escorts sent on bearing lines found only foam and shame. He did not have to hate Americans to admit what they did. He had to survive them. That is what makes his perspective valuable. It does not come from a cheering section. It comes from a professional who ran out of answers in a world that kept changing without his consent. What he could not see were the people who built his problem. A girl at a typewriter in Pearl Harbor mimeographed a change that told skippers to go for under-keel shots and standardize post-firing evasion. A machinist in Forest Park set torque on a motor that would hum under the Sea of Japan. A tender electrician in Saipan polished a relay contact so a firing circuit would not hesitate. A chief torpedoman stroked a warhead seam with his palm and said, "Hot, straight and normal," for himself more than for inspection. Americans did not beat him by miracle. They beat him by adding these hands into one mind. On Hara's bridge, the air smelled like hot metal and cordite. The soundman called bearings that refused to settle. The captain had to choose. Sprint at a last, known, lay a broad pattern, or guard the convoy while he bled from uncertainty. He chose with courage. Courage could not change physics. A weapon with no wake and little noise erases the link between shot and shooter. When the link is gone, even brave men move through fog with knives in their hands and no shapes to swing at. He was not blind. The world had turned off his lights. The shock deepened as months gathered. Rumors about silent fish turned into habits. Sail at night, hug coasts, stack cargo on deck, add escorts, drill harder. Losses kept climbing. Hara watched the biggest symbols fall. He could not change the factories that slowed for lack of fuel, or the squadrons that flew fewer hours. He listened to men sing songs of loyalty on decks that would soon be cut away under them. He was not a villain. He was a professional standing in a river that had changed course. The American side saw him without hate. Skippers wrote in logs about skilled escorts and aggressive counterattacks. They did not celebrate when a ship broke. They recorded it, reloaded, and escaped. A rescued Japanese petty officer, wrapped in a blanket on a US deck, told an interpreter, "There was no wake. We never saw it." He drank coffee that tasted like mercy and stared at the machine that had undone his world. Even in war, abundance can feel like a weapon. Two voices deserve to meet on the page, even if they never met at sea. Hara's cool respect and a US sailor's plain pride. "We aim under the keel," the sailor might say, "because that's where the ship gives up." Hara might answer, "We aimed at a wake that was no longer there." Between them lies the reason America won learning faster, building faster, telling the truth faster. The Mark-18 was a symptom of that culture, not the cause. The cause was a republic that lets its people fix things in the open. If you need one scene to hold in your mind, take this. Hara orders a search along a bearing line drawn from foam. Depth charges tumble and, bloom, the ship rolls. Men clutch rails. Sweat smells like fear and duty. Below, a US boat has already turned 10 degrees and dropped 6 meters. The skipper ticks off seconds. The radio man whispers code that keeps a second boat from tripping the first. The torpedomen cradle another electric and slide it into the tube. 2 realities in one patch of sea. One belongs to habit. One belongs to improvement. By war's end, Hara's world had narrowed to brave acts with shrinking consequences. The United States did not humiliate him. It made him obsolete. That is the most American victory. Not to mock a worthy foe, but to take away his tools and leave him with only his heart. Hearts deserve honor. Tools decide outcomes. The quiet torpedo wrote that truth under thousands of hulls. Hara stood on his bridge and learned it the hardest way a seaman can learn anything, by watching a ship he loved fold as if the ocean had hands. When peace finally arrived, the charts came down, the pins were counted, and the wall with all the tonnage went quiet. Hara wrote his memories. American sailors folded their uniforms and went home. Somewhere in a museum, a Mark-18 sits with its nose open like a book. If you look at it long enough, you can hear both voices, a professional's respect for an enemy who earned it, and a free people's pride in the tools, truth, and teamwork that turned silence into victory. That is how the Pacific changed flags. That is how a republic proves itself at sea. A Japanese anti-submarine officer knew the signs: the white rooster tail of a steam torpedo, the shriek of a turbine, the bearing line that pointed straight back to the shooter. Then the signs died. The Mark-18 electric torpedo came from the tube like a held breath, ran about 29 knots without bubbles, and struck under the keel where ships are weakest. From a periscope it looked like nothing. From a target's bilges it felt like the earth had lifted. There was no wake. We never saw it. That sentence moved through mess decks and wardrooms like a chill. On American boats the opposite emotion took hold. Calm. A weapon that did what the manual promised, turned fear into timing, and timing into hits. The sea became a stage where only one side could see the script. Under-keel detonation is its own physics lesson. A charge centered beneath the hull doesn't just tear metal. It creates a gas bubble that lifts and drops the ship so fast the keel snaps like a board. Turrets wrench free. Bulkheads crumple. A vessel that might limp home with side damage folds in place. American skippers learned to aim for that effect with the Mark-18 and to vanish before escorts guessed a bearing that wasn't there. Post-shot doctrine became ritual. Change depth, change course, stay on battery, listen for the first pattern, and let the enemy hunt yesterday. The terror for professionals was the mismatch between training and reality. Hydrophone men listened for the steam whine that never came. Lookouts searched for wakes that did not exist. Depth-charge teams laid tight patterns over ghosts. Brave crews followed drills that the new weapon had made obsolete. On the American side, quiet motors were matched by quiet competence. Torpedomen nursing gyros. Chiefs checking contact pistols by touch. Quartermasters keeping the periscope just high enough to write a pencil line on the sea without betraying height. Precision like that makes courage pay. The Mark-18 did not arrive alone. It rode in on a system factories that built batteries and motors to interchangeable standards, tenders that swapped relays at forward bases, and a headquarters that told crews exactly what worked. That combination turned an engineering choice into a campaign. Ships began breaking in half at ranges and angles that earlier doctrine called risky. Convoy commanders who once trusted night and zigzags learned that silence belongs to whoever can use it. The Americans used it like a language. In the end, fear on enemy bridges had a simple source. The link between torpedo and shooter was gone. You could not see it, hear it, or trace it. You could only feel your ship lift, then fail. The Mark-18 removed certainty from combat and replaced it with American intent. That is why seasoned professionals called it uncanny. It made their training yesterday and our victory tomorrow. The rule in a free navy is simple. Question everything, then write down the answer so the next crew lives. Early patrols proved the pain duds, deep runners, bad exploders. Admiral Charles Lockwood refused to hide the truth. He ordered test shots into instrumented nets, smashed open pistols on benches, and published the results. Disable the magnetic feature, recalibrate depth, rework contacts. The fixes spread by mimeograph and tender torque until they became muscle memory from Pearl to Fremantle. Failures that would have been secrets elsewhere became instructions here. That honesty saved lives and multiplied kills. The question did not stop with the Mark-18. Even as the Mark-18 proved itself, the force kept asking how to make good better. Sonar sets gained cleaner ranges. Radar tactics pushed wolf packs into perfect geometry. Post-firing procedures were drilled until men could execute them, while the hull boomed with depth charges. Logistics tightened, spare brushes and relays pre-positioned, torpedo schools teaching under, keel doctrine as standard, not trick. Every patrol ended with a report that was treated like a blueprint for the next patrol's survival. You could feel the rhythm: fight, learn, fix, repeat. This habit problem, test, fix, share, was the quiet superweapon. A chief who documented a bulky gyro didn't fear for his career. He expected the shop to send a better one and the fleet to get the memo. A skipper who tried a new approach angle found his sketch becoming doctrine next month if results proved out. You could feel the culture shift in the language of orders. Fewer slogans, more verbs. Change depth. Alter course. Fire again. Escape, report, improve. The system taught courage how to think. The enemy noticed the effect without seeing the gears. Escorts that had once predicted American moves began to fail at prediction itself. Even their successes taught us. When a pattern fell too close to last known, the fleet standardized a two-step evasion that moved the datum by habit. When mines blocked gates, Operation Barney proved sonar and nerve could read a path anyway. Learning outran fear. Improvement outran luck. By late 1944, the submarine force felt like a factory for results. That is the American way under fire. We are not perfect on page 1, we are relentless by page 10. The Mark-18 is the emblem, but the system is the story. Truth accepted, tools improved, procedures shared, courage trusted. Question everything, win everything. The ocean rewards that kind of honesty with survival first, and with victory when the ledger closes. In that closing stretch, boats went to sea expecting their weapons to behave and their leaders to listen. That confidence made men bolder but also calmer. It turned chaos into checklists and fear into timing. You can hear it in the logbooks, short lines, precise times, hits recorded without drama. The work was deadly, the method was American. The scoreboard looked impossible even to those who built it. Less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, its submariners, accounted for the majority of Japanese shipping losses. Roughly 4.7 to 4.8 million tons of merchant shipping and more than 500,000 tons of naval vessels sent under. Tankers mattered most, and they died in droves. By mid-1945, some boats struggled to find targets because there were too few left to sink. That is a victory, so complete it erases its own evidence. The pins on the big wall map thinned because the sea lanes had already been subtracted. Spadefish wrote figures like a factory foreman. Ship after ship entered in the log and crossed off enemy's ledger. Bowfin stitched 9 patrols across the ocean like sutures, closing routes that used to feel safe. Archerfish found the carrier Shinano at night, fired, and watched the biggest warship ever sunk by a submarine disappear into the dark. Parsh rammed through a convoy in daylight and earned Lawson P. Red. Ramage a Medal of Honor he accepted with the shrug of a professional. Each name is a column in the sum. Cost was part of the sum. 50. 2 boats never came home. More than 3,400 officers and men were lost. The casualty rate cut deep into a small community that wore its dolphins like a quiet oath. The wall of plaques in every submarine museum is the footnote that makes the headline honest. We won by learning fast and striking hard, but we paid in names and chairs left empty. The wider effects reached places most crews never saw. Fuel shortfalls, grounded training, factories idled for want of coal and oil. Island garrisons stared at silent piers. Radio intelligence heard the strain in traffic that begged for tankers that were already rust on the bottom. When the Hellcats proved the Sea of Japan could be entered and hunted, even the Empire's pantry was raided. The circle closed. There was no safe lane, and soon there were no lanes at all. What makes this ledger American is how it was drawn. Engineers, typists, machinists, skippers, and kids in torpedo rooms all wrote lines in the same hand. Truth first, then improvement, then action. The Mark-18's silence was the point on the spear, but behind it stood a nation that allowed candor and rewarded competence. The scoreboard was not a miracle. It was a republic doing math in steel and battery acid, and the answer was freedom afloat. Even enemy professionals admitted the curve. They saw wakes vanish, convoys mauled from two sides, and ports that once bustled turned quiet. Numbers ended arguments, and the arguments stayed ended. The quiet thunder became a nation's signature. By war's end, the submarine force had strangled Japan's movement. More than half of all merchant losses, millions of tons gone, warships erased, and fuel so scarce that airfields turned into parking lots. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, Shinano, went down tonight, nerve, and a spread that worked. 9 boats in Operation Barney crossed mined straits and killed in the Sea of Japan, proving sanctuary a myth. Patrol reports read like factory ledgers because the process never fell asleep. Plan, fire, vanish, report, improve. This outcome flowed from values. We copied what worked, fixed what failed, and built at speed. We trusted a machinist's torque number and a yeoman's stencil as much as a captain's courage. We told the truth about the Mark-14, adopted the Mark-18, and standardized the post-shot dance that made depth charges chase yesterday. Factories said, "One every shift," and beat it. Tenders made forward anchorages into machine shops. A 19-year-old with steady hands turned a gyro setting into history. The enemy's last view of the war at sea was often a plume where a ship had been, and searchlights clawing a sky that held nothing. Professionals like Tamechi Hara wrote with clear eyes about amazing Allied advances and the loss of supremacy that followed. Their bravery never faltered, their options did. When a weapon removes the link between shot and shooter, habit dies and fear creeps into doctrine. The United States did not gloat, it improved. Count the final images that prove the impossible. A pin-covered map where lanes turn white with absence. A stack of patrol flags so high a skipper laughs to hold them. A rescued aviator sitting on a steel deck, sipping coffee, staring at a machine that saved him and sank his enemies before lunch. 52 boats missing from every celebration, their names spoken like prayer. A Mark-18 inches a museum, quiet as always, still teaching. What no other nation could have achieved at that speed was the marriage of truth to tools and tools to trust. That is our inheritance. It is why a whisper underwater sounded like freedom. When America organizes its decency and its industry, even the ocean learns new rules. The last line in the last log is the only epitaph needed. Commenced firing, hits observed, target sunk, survivors rescued, patrol complete, war ending. Silence, at last on our terms. The crews came home lean and older, but sure of one thing, a free country that listens and builds can bend fate. They hung up their dolphins, hugged families, and slept without depth charges in their dreams. The ocean kept its secrets. America kept its promise.